Luring boys and young men back to his apartment, Fritz Haarmann would murder these innocent victims using his signature act that he called the love bite, earning him the nickname the Vampire. My name's Emma, this is Tiki Bar True Crimes, and I'd like to tell you the case of Fritz Haarmann. I'd just like to welcome everyone, and if you're new here and you like true crime, please give that subscribe button a hit. Fritz Haarmann was a German serial killer who began his murder spree in 1918 and finished in 1924. He has a potential victim count of up to 70. Born in 1879 to his mother Johanna and father Ollie, Fritz Haarmann was a very quiet child. He was quite isolated. He didn't really play with other children and kept mainly to his siblings. He was the youngest of 6. At an early age, it was very evident that Fritz preferred playing with things that would be traditionally thought of as girls' toys and activities, including dolls, needlework and cooking. As this was the early 20th century, views were more traditional back then, and this certainly made Fritz stand out. He didn't particularly get on with his father Ollie, who was very argumentative, had little time for his children and was a womanizer, had many affairs. Despite their troubled marriage, his mother and father remained together until his mother died in 1901. Fritz Haarmann was very close to his mother. Being the youngest of 6, she spoilt and mollycoddled him. This didn't go unnoticed by the teachers, who said that he came across as a spoilt child. Despite this, they said that his behaviour at school was impeccable, really, but his academic abilities were far below par. He actually had to take one school year twice. When he finally completed school at the age of 15, he went into the military, where he excelled. He really enjoyed his time there. However, after just 5 months, he started experiencing periods of unconsciousness, which would later be diagnosed as something similar to epilepsy. He was discharged and returned to Hanover. By this point, Fritz is 16 years old, and this is when his criminal activities begin. He would SA young boys by luring them into secluded areas, mainly cellars. He did this multiple times. Due to the regular occurrence of these offences, he was ordered to go into a mental institution where he was evaluated. The psychiatrist there said he was incurably deranged and ordered that he remain in an institution for the rest of his life. He was committed and deemed a danger to society. However, after just 7 months, he managed to escape with the help of his mother. They fled to Switzerland, where Fritz lived with a relative. He got a job as a handyman and stayed there for around 16 months before returning to Hanover, Germany. On return, he quickly met and engaged a girl, Erna, who became pregnant with their first child. In 1900, Fritz was ordered to complete his compulsory military service. Again, he really did well in the military. He later said that this was the happiest time of his life. However, these dizzy spells began again, and after just 2 years, he was formally discharged. On return, he reunited with his fiancée Erna and started working at his father's factory. If you remember, him and his father didn't really get on. Fritz ended up trying to sue his father, saying that he couldn't do the work that was given to him because of his medical conditions. These charges were later dropped. However, Fritz and his father Ollie did get into a vicious argument. It was incredibly violent, and his father ended up later trying to sue him, saying that Fritz had threatened to kill him, blackmailed him. He tried to get his son re-institutionalized, saying that he was a danger. Again, these charges were dropped, but Fritz was ordered to do a psych evaluation again. This doctor said that Fritz Haarmann wasn't incurably deranged, and although he was mentally inferior to others, he wasn't mentally unstable. After working a couple of jobs, Fritz actually ended up being classified as disabled and unable to work. Because of this, the army did increase his pension. Erna, his fiancée, also broke off their engagement. There were rumours that he was having an affair with a young male student. She also took the fishmongers that they owned together because it was registered solely in her name. So by this point, Fritz no longer has a fiancée, he no longer officially can work. He is angry and he resorts to crime, mainly petty theft and burglary. He did occasionally get the odd job, however, he inevitably ended up just stealing from them. Consequently, because of all of this and the burglaries and the petty theft, he spent most of his time in jail between the years 1905 and 1918. So by 1918, this is the end of World War I, which Germany lost. There is high rates of poverty in the country. Fritz ends up, despite his criminal history and outward homosexuality, which you have to remember is illegal at this time, becoming a police informant. And not just an average police informant. He was a very reliable and popular police informant. He would store stolen goods for criminals and then tip off the police to raid them. In the process, Fritz would be arrested himself to avoid superstition. As a police informant, he would use this position of power to lure his victims back to his apartment. Sometimes on the pretense of arrest, sometimes just to offer them accommodation or food. Once back to the apartment, he would proceed to strangle them, and this is when he would perform his signature act, which was to bite fiercely into the victim's throat, specifically their Adam's apple. All of his victims were boys or young men aged between 10 and 22. After SAing them, strangling them, and then doing this horrific vampire act which would kill them, he would then go on to horrifically dismember them and dump their bodies in the local river. Fritz would often keep personal possessions of his victims as trophies, or even gift them to his lover Hans at the time, and even friends. He would often sell them on the black market as well, and even to respectable retailers. There was also a rumour that he used the flesh of these bodies to create contraband meat. Now, Fritz was in the contraband meat trade and his meat was often boneless, diced or ground. And the thought of these young boys and men being horrifically murdered in some vampire-like style, dismembered and then sold as meat is just horrific. Fritz's first known victim was 17-year-old Friedel Roth, who was last seen on the 25th of September 1918. Friends actually said to police that the last place they saw him was with Fritz Haarmann, and the family put immense pressure on police to investigate him, to see whether he knew where their son was. The police ended up raiding Fritz's apartment and found a 13-year-old semi-naked boy in there with him. On finding this 13-year-old boy semi-naked, clearly being abused by Fritz, I think maybe they were so shocked that they actually never searched his apartment. If they did, they would have found the severed head of 17-year-old Friedel wrapped in newspaper and shoved at the back of Fritz's stove. On finding him abusing a 13-year-old minor, he was convicted and sentenced to 9 months, which he didn't serve immediately. He served like nearly 18 months later. During this time, Fritz met his lover Hans, who was an 18-year-old runaway. Now, Hans had no money, no job, was in a desperate situation, and actually initiated contact with Fritz himself. Although Hans was a heterosexual, Fritz Haarmann was a well-known homosexual at the time, and Hans offered him sexual services in return for payment. Fritz took a real shining to Hans and saw him as the son he never had. He wanted to save him from the gutters, so Hans ended up moving in with Fritz and they became lovers. Now you would think the power dynamic between these two would be that Fritz was in charge, had more power, but it really wasn't. Hans would mock and belittle him and also had his own female girlfriends. Despite all this, Fritz was smitten with Hans and let him get away with all this ridicule. Not only was Hans Fritz's lover, he was also his criminal accomplice. So Fritz finally serves his 9 months for the SA of a minor, and on release he becomes a police informant again. Despite the fact that he is a convicted criminal for abuse, he's also a person of interest in the missing 17-year-old boy Friedel. Despite all this, he carries on working with police and again is a popular and reliable informant. In 1921, Fritz obtains an apartment with his lover Hans in a densely populated area right next to the River Leine. This is when Fritz murders his second victim, another 17-year-old boy whom he met at Hanover Central Station. Now he met most of his victims at Hanover Central Station and they were either commuters, runaways, homeless, and occasionally they were also male sex workers. This second victim is Fritz Frank, who is a 17-year-old pianist. He meets Haarmann at the station and goes back to his apartment where he subsequently meets Fritz's lover Hans and 2 female friends that happen to be there. Now Hans whispers to one of these female acquaintances, "Hey, this boy's gonna get trampled today." Now this is important because later on there's a lot of speculation over how much Hans knew about his lover Fritz Haarmann's criminal murderous activities. This comment would insinuate that Hans knew a lot. Fritz Haarmann even states at trial later on that after murdering this boy in an horrific vampire-like way, Hans actually walks in while this poor boy's body is lying on the bed. He takes one look and just says, "Oh, when shall I come back?" Just 5 weeks after murdering Fritz Frank, Fritz Haarmann murders another 17-year-old boy, Wilhelm Schlutz, who is a commuter whom he meets at a railway station. Whilst living in that apartment, Fritz goes on to murder 2 more boys, 16-year-old Roland, who ran away from home to join the Marines, and 19-year-old Hans Sonnefeld, who wore a distinctive yellow coat. After murdering Sonnefeld, Fritz Haarmann went around wearing that distinctive yellow coat. Fritz and Hans move apartment in June 1923, and just 2 weeks after moving in, their neighbour's 13-year-old boy, Ernest Ergberg, goes missing. 2 months later, an 18-year-old office clerk, Heinrich Strube, goes missing. And shortly after that, 17-year-old victim Paul Bronowski goes missing as well. When they raid the apartment later, they find the 13-year-old boy's braces, along with various other items from the 2 other victims. He goes on to murder at least 5 other victims, including a 13-year-old boy who missed his last train home. The following year, in 1924, Fritz murdered a 10-year-old boy who was playing truant from school. His name was Frederick Albling. Another victim was a 17-year-old travelling salesman who Fritz's lover Hans insisted he killed because he had a really nice suit that Hans wanted. His final victim was 17-year-old Erik de Vries, whom he murdered on the 24th of June 1924. He met this teenager at the train station, which he often did, and went on to murder and dismember his body. Fritz admitted that it took him 4 trips to dispose of all the body parts, and the bag he used actually belonged to one of his previous victims. The first discovery of these remains found in the river was actually made 2 months prior to Fritz's last victim. 2 children were playing along the riverbank and came across a skull. Initially, police were unsure of the origins of this skull. They didn't know whether it was a grave robber disposing of the body, a murder victim, or even medical students playing a prank. They did identify the skull as being a male aged between 18 and 20. 2 weeks later, another skull was found, and then shortly after that, some boys were playing in a field when they discovered a bag of bones. Very shortly after that, 2 more skulls were found along this riverbank. For over a year, people of this town had been talking about the disproportionate number of missing men and boys. Hundreds of people from the local community got together to search this river. They wanted to know what had happened to these boys and men. They went on to discover multiple human bones, which they then gave to police. On receiving this, police decided to just dredge the entire river that ran through that city and ended up finding over 500 human bones. Many of them showed signs of being dissected and scalped, and almost all of them were young men and boys. Suspicion immediately landed on Fritz Haarmann. He was a known convict, an abuser of young boys, and a homosexual, and if you remember, he was also linked to the previous missing boy Friedel Roth, whom if they just searched his apartment at the time, they would have found his severed head. So they began to monitor Fritz, and they actually allocated 2 policemen to survey him. They ended up at Hanover Station, where they saw Fritz Haarmann and a 15-year-old boy having a very heated argument. They decided to intervene, and Fritz stated that they should arrest this 15-year-old boy because he was trying to travel with forged documents. They took them all back to the police station, where this poor boy then told them that he had actually been staying with Fritz for the last 4 days and had been repeatedly SA'd and threatened with a knife. Fritz Haarmann was immediately arrested, and the police went to search his apartment. On arriving, it was horrific. There was blood staining everywhere, all over the ceilings, the walls, all over the beds. Fritz tried to pass this off as him being involved in contraband meat. However, they also interviewed a number of neighbours who said that they were a little concerned about the amount of teenage boys that frequented his apartment. They said they would often see him leaving with suspicious bags. One neighbour was so concerned he actually followed Fritz and saw him disposing of a large heavy sack into the river. His apartment was also full of personal items and possessions from many of the victims that were identified by family members. Additionally, a skull of one of the missing boys was found in his garden. Once this happened, Fritz just collapsed and started to confess while weeping in his sister's arms. He admitted to essaying, murdering and dismembering the bodies of various boys during the years 1918 to 1924. He said it was brought on by this rapid sexual desire, and that he didn't actually mean to murder any of them, but he felt an intense need to bite into their throat. He said that he sincerely disliked dismembering their bodies and found the process quite horrific. He said he had to have a strong cup of coffee beforehand, but the passion and desire to SA and bite his victims far outweighed the horrific act of actually dismembering them. He said that this process would take up to 2 days. He also stated that he smashed their skulls to pieces so that none of those skulls that they discovered were any of his victims. He notoriously lied though to get out of any murder that there wasn't substantial evidence for. He himself admitted that there are many other victims who haven't been accounted for, and he states that he has a victim count of between 50 and 70. Fritz was charged with the murder of 27 young men and boys. 14 of those he pled guilty to. Hans, his lover, was charged with accessory to murder, which he pled not guilty. Their trial lasted 2 weeks, and they had over 190 witnesses that came forward for the prosecution, stating that they had seen various teenage boys entering that apartment, that Fritz would leave with suspicious looking bags and sacks. Also, his landlady said that he would boil bits of meat and then strain the fat into bottles. She went on to say that after consuming some of Haarmann's sausages, her and her family became ill. 2 female acquaintances of Fritz and Hans also said that one time they saw what they believed to be a human mouth boiling in a soup kettle. They actually took this to police, who just dismissed this as being a pig's snout. Fritz was found guilty of 24 of the 27 murders he was charged with. He was sentenced to death by beheading, which he accepted fully. He stated that, "I shall go to the decapitating block joyfully and happily." He made no appeal against his sentence and said that his death would be an atonement for his crimes. Hans had a very different reaction when he was found guilty and sentenced to be beheaded as well. He became hysterical and ended up completely breaking down in his cell. Fritz Haarmann was only told the evening prior that he was going to be beheaded the next day. His last request was a strong Brazilian coffee and the ability to smoke a cigar in his cell. On the day of his execution, he seemed very pale and nervous, but seemed to try to maintain some sense of bravado. When he walked to the guillotine, he said this: "I am guilty, gentlemen, but hard though it may be, I want to die as a man." Just before placing his head on the guillotine, he added, "I repent, but I do not fear death." We will never know how many young boys and men Fritz Haarmann killed. We actually don't even know when he started. They say it was 1918, but he may well have began his killing spree before. After Fritz's execution, parts of his brain were actually removed to be analysed. They did find signs of meningitis. His whole head was actually preserved in formaldehyde and kept at a medical school until 2014, when it was then cremated. They actually found a letter from Fritz Haarmann saying that Hans, his lover, wasn't involved in any of the murders, that Hans was actually innocent, and that Fritz just made up his involvement as an act of revenge. After this evidence came to light, Hans was actually granted a retrial and his sentence was reduced to 2 concurrent 12-year sentences. After serving these, he stayed in Hanover until he died in 1975. The remains of their victims were recovered and they were all buried together. A large granite memorial was erected with the names and ages of all the victims inscribed on it. The discovery of these murders subsequently stirred a wave of homophobia in Germany. One historian stated that it split the gay rights movement irreparably, fed every prejudice against homosexuality. Not only did this case send a wave of homophobia throughout this town, it also questioned the validity of the death sentence, how mentally unstable people are treated, as well as how police handle cases and who should actually be an informant. That was the horrific case of Fritz Haarmann, or who is also known as the vampire. If you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe and comment. If you have any suggestions for cases, please leave them in the comments below and I will see you in the next one. If you remember,